Each week, American History TV's American Artifacts takes you to museums and historic places.
I'm Don Ritchie, the Senate historian, and we're in the Senate Caucus room, which is in the Russell Senate Office Building. Before C-SPAN started covering the Senate in 1986, this was the most famous room in the Capitol and in the Capitol complex, because this is where the major hearings had been televised going back to the, well, newsreels covered it back in the 1920s and 30s, but television came along in the 1940s. In 1941, a senator from Missouri named Harry Truman says that we're getting ready to go to war, we're spending millions of dollars in defense, we need to look into the way the defense contracts are being allocated. We need to make sure that money is being spent wisely and we're not being gypped by unscrupulous developers. And in fact, Truman was a great scholar of history and had read a lot about the American Civil War and knew that a lot of shoddy equipment had been sold to the government during that period. And so he held investigations in here. But Truman also had read enough about the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which made life very difficult for Abraham Lincoln. And he decided he was not going to do that again. So whenever he discovered any irregularities that involved government officials, he always tipped off the White House ahead of time. So the president could fire that person or reorganize that before Truman held his public hearings on this. So he was not a thorn in the president's side. And as a result, when Franklin Roosevelt was looking for a vice president in 1944, Truman was acceptable to him and got on the ticket and of course became president as a result of that. So the Truman Committee certainly was a big boost to its chairman, as well as saved the federal government millions of dollars and probably put a lot better equipment out on the field when the government did go to war. The Truman Committee still exists, by the way, because after the war was over, the Senate made it the permanent subcommittee on investigations, and it still is part of the operations, it's part of the Homeland Security Committee. It's still carrying on investigations, and it's been doing that famously for the last half century. Of course, after Truman left that committee continued during looking into the war contracting, and its most famous hearings actually were in the late 1940s when Howard Hughes testified. One of the issues that was brought up was that during the war, Hughes was dealing with a lot of government contracts, and whenever Air Force personnel would come to see him about the planes that he was building, he would say, "General, you're just a superb manager. When this war is over, you have a job with Hughes Aircraft." And of course, that made them even more sympathetic towards making sure that he got the contracts. And so the movie Aviator is about a lot about his testimony in this before what was known at that point as the Truman Committee, even though Truman wasn't the chairman of it.
Senator, may I ask a question?
Well, now, if you'll just wait till I issue a subpoena for Mr. Mars, I've asked you whether or not you would produce him, and you said you didn't know, as I understand it.
I don't remember if that was my answer.
Well, what was your answer?
I don't remember. Get it off the record.
Well, now, Mr. Hughes, I'm asking you what your answer was. And we're not going to have this bickering back and forth. You are before this committee, and you're going to answer the question.
You asked me just now.
In the 1960s, this is the room where Senator J. William Fulbright is interrogating members of the Johnson administration about American policy in Vietnam, and is also giving equal time to critics like George Kennan and to others who had raised issues about. It was the first time that anti-war speakers got a national platform. The Johnson administration did not like that, and they prevailed on CBS to stop broadcasting during the day these hearings because they didn't want to give that kind of platform to opponents of the war. And so CBS went back to running I Love Lucy episodes, and Fred Friendly quit as the president of CBS News as a result of this suppression that was going on that the administration had put forward. So Senator Fulbright's hearings, he called them educational hearings, was the first time that Americans realized that there was more than one side in the Vietnam War story, and that it had a big impact, I think, in terms of the growing anti-war movement. I was once asked by a radio correspondent to describe this room to a radio audience that couldn't see it. And I said, you know, this room always reminds me of Grand Opera because it's a magnificent setting. When there's an investigation, it usually has a large cast of characters and a very convoluted plot, and everyone sits around waiting for the witness to sing.
Senator Brewster's story, as related here yesterday, is a pack of lies, and I can tear it apart if allowed to cross-question him. And it is unfair to place me in the position of having my integrity questioned and not being allowed to cross-examine Senator Brewster.
All right, you understood that, and the record is